those who want to go into the Jewish world, they are going to remember October 7th as their wake-up call, or maybe their October 8th is their wake-up call. And that is going to change all the organizations in Jewish life. And Hillel, if it, I think, wants to be the organization that it has been for the past 100 years, is going to have to recognize that that is what is coming down the pipeline, whether they want it or not.
For many Jewish parents and grandparents, Hillel holds a special place in their memories of college life. Founded in 1923 as a modest program above a barbershop at the University of Illinois, Hillel grew into a leading Jewish campus organization, now present on many hundreds of campuses. For generations, it was where Jewish students found community, celebrated Shabbat, and felt at home as Jews while navigating the challenges of university life. Today, Hillel faces a crisis. That's the view of the writer and former Krauthammer fellow, and now I'll add Tikvah colleague, Josh Tolle. Before joining our team at Tikvah, Tolle worked at Hillel for 3 years, and he saw the organization's reaction to October 7th and all the campus frenzy that would come after it up close. In the December 2025 issue of Commentary, Josh published an essay, If Hillel Is Not for Jews, Who Will Be? It is an examination of how progressive ideology has weakened Hillel's ability to serve its own students, especially in the days, weeks, and months after October 7th, when Jewish institutions were most needed. Galvanized by that day, Tolle explains how Jewish students looked to their Hillel centers on campus, seeking clarity and strength, only to encounter what he calls muddled objectives and self-defeating strategies. Welcome to the Tikvah podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. I want to emphasize that Josh's essay, and indeed our conversation, are not simply meant as criticism alone. As Josh makes clear, calling attention to the ways that Hillel has strayed from its own mission is necessary, precisely because that mission is worth restoring. Hillel's crisis, he also argues, reflects a larger condition in American Jewish life, particularly among pluralistic institutions. And it is a set of challenges that must be contended with, indeed, if they're going to be capable of serving the rising generation. If you enjoy this conversation, you can discover more big ideas and in-depth analysis on Judaism, Israel, and America and the West at tikvahideas.org. Subscribe to access our full library of podcasts, videos, and essays, and join a growing community focused on Jewish life and the glories of Western civilization. You can subscribe to the Tikvah podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. I hope you leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and X. Here now is my conversation with Josh Tolle. Josh Tolle, welcome to the Tikvah podcast.
Thank you, John, for having me on.
The essay begins with these 3 devastating quotes from Hillel's staff and students. Number 1, I just hated myself when I was Hillel president. Number 2, I was singled out among the staff because I'm an Israeli. And number 3, sometimes I feel there's no standard of what Jewish is. Your essay is, as you describe it, an SOS, a message in a bottle. What is the emergency at Hillel?
The emergency is a lack of will to survive. I think that's how I would put it down in just a phrase. And what the result of that is, practically, is the kinds of quotes that you just read off, John. Those quotes were really pulled from dozens of interviews that I did. They were just the tip of the iceberg, but the lack of a will for survival, a lack of willingness to fight for Judaic and Western civilizational values ends up making staff and students, alumni and parents, community members, and anyone related to the organization feel, if they're in the wrong Hillel at the wrong time, like they don't want to be there and like they don't belong.
Well, you describe a mismatch between the students who are arriving at Hillel and the staff and leadership groups at Hillel. You describe, on the one hand, passionate, committed Zionist students showing up after October 7th, feeling that that had been a galvanizing event, that something had been sparked in them, where they wanted to feel at home in a Jewish context, and one, moreover, in which Israel was not something to be ashamed of, but something to embrace at that moment. They arrived at Hillel, and then this is just a quote from you, only to be offered muddled objectives and self-defeating strategies. What did they need, and what didn't they get there?
Yeah. John, I think that what students needed most of all was loud, visible, proud Judaism. And I can actually just speak from my own experiences as I, tell people in the essay, I've been on both sides of this thing. And I had a really crucial conversation with a student on October 8th and this didn't make it into the final draft of the essay, but this student was coming as part of a delegation of students, and she had nothing more to say than that, hey, letting you at Hillel know that we are organizing a rally for students to come together on Monday, October 9th, because this is something that we need right now. We didn't organize it. I mean, we supported and we assisted.
We meaning at that point, you as a professional staff member at Hillel.
Yeah, this was completely student organized. And of course, we supported it every, step of the way. But the reality is that the crucial conversation that I had with the student was she wanted to call it a rally. And I said, you should call it a vigil. You should call it a memorial because that's less provocative. It's going to be less likely that you're going to get protesters to come to this event. And she stood her ground and she said, absolutely not. This is a rally. We are rallying Jews together and people who support Jews because that's what we need. We don't need a vigil. We don't need a memorial. We're going to have plenty of time for mourning. And I fought with her. I told her I didn't think this was appropriate. I didn't want to advertise it. And at the end of the day, I relented, not because I thought she was right, but after October 9th, when that rally was had, I realized that she was right, that it needed to be a rally, and it didn't need to be a vigil. It didn't need to be low key. And the SJP and all of those elements that came and protested, they would have protested either way.
Right. SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, one of the campus student groups that is most supportive of Hamas terrorists. So when you were arguing with a student, were you saying that because that was Hillel policy, or you were saying that just because at the time you were still sort of conveying the general sense and sensibility of Hillel, which is not to be confrontational, and we'll get into some of that in a minute, some of the way that Hillel understands its own mission and itself. But was that were you explicitly instructed to try to moderate or tamp down that kind of student activism?
So I was not. And I will say that there is an ethos about Hillel, and it depends on the Hillel, but it's not really, and this is something I think that may have been missed in the essay, is that ultimately the essay is about Hillel as an example of a larger spiritual condition for American Jewry. And so I don't think it's down to Hillel. I think that was in me. And I think it has to do with the way in which progressivism and Judaism have been sort of mushed together in our current brand of liberal mainstream Judaism. And I think that is what I was speaking out of, that sense that I was nervous. I was scared maybe even to be too loud and too brash. And what I will say is that I wasn't the only person on my staff who felt that way. And from the conversations I had with colleagues and students at different Hillels across the nation, that was a recurring tension between how the staff felt, who had had more time to imbibe this kind of feeling that was part of the American Jewish, condition writ large, versus those of the students who, even before October 7th, had already been activated by experiences they had had in high school or college.
So in that respect, though this is an essay which is really about Hillel, and we're going to continue to drill into some of the more particular conditions and circumstances that make that institution, that complex institution, which is both a national brand and a series of very federated, franchised local staffs, which have some different degrees of autonomy and independence. We'll get into all that structure in a few minutes. Nevertheless, because this is an essay which looks at Hillel, I think it's useful for you to now emphasize for us that in your eyes, Josh, the example of Hillel also illustrates a larger, you could say, condition of non-Orthodox Judaism or pluralistic Judaism in America, and its own confusion. What we see at Hillel is an expression, a concrete distillation of that larger problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's step into some of the evidence that you bring in the essay. And I want to talk about what ideological capture actually looks like on the ground. You describe a woman named Rabbi Jessica Lott at Northwestern. She is a recipient of Hillel's highest honor. And you write she writes that she wrote, I think in the Northwestern newspaper, more than one party needs to cease their fire. And she urged students to hold as true a story that conflicts with your truth. She wrote those things soon after October 7th. I want to ask you what you think she was trying to say, and now in retrospect, what you see, how you see that failed to meet the needs of her students.
Yeah. So I think that the quotes that I took from Rabbi Jessica Lott's essays, but also some of the other Hillel staff that I quoted, I think in general what they're getting at is this kind of mantra of see both sides, recognize difference. There's always a way to solve the bloody conflict if you can just get to some kind of agreement. You can find some kind of common ground. And unfortunately, especially after October 7th, this is just an insufficient way to respond to what are in fact real, fatal, and bloody realities. American Jews are not fighting that battle on the battlefield. But at the same time, American Jews are still confronted by the rhetoric that is coming on social media, that is often being coordinated by actual terrorist networks. And what is most insufficient is that Jewish students need someone to actually just stand strong and to say, actually, you don't have to see the other side on this, because the other side of this does want to see you cease to exist.
Yeah, it's a little bit like saying, step number one is your recognition, Josh, that though college students who are looking to get a Shabbat meal at Hillel, though most of them are not fighting on the actual physical, literal battleground in Gaza, nevertheless, often against their wishes and will, but even for that, no less truly, they are conscripted into the battle of ideas and are targets because they're Jews and have to have some rhetorical ammunition to use in response to their attacks.
Yeah.
And looking to the generals, if you like, in this battle of ideas, what they heard was, yeah, I know that Hamas wants to kill our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel, but you have to sort of sympathize with their point of view.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I do think it almost comes down to that. And I would, emphasize again that I worked at Hillel for 3 years, and I got to know my colleagues well. And I don't think that most of them, some exceptions, I don't think most of them are true anti-Zionists. I don't think that, they were palling it up at the encampments. But what I do think is that there's a lot of confusion. And I think moral confusion in particular at a time that you cannot have this kind of doubt or kind of division or sense of, I think, a really vacillating between a desire to appease progressive values and the reality of a really dangerous situation. And I think, yeah, that's how I put it for now.
Well, so let's try to understand the way that Hillel professionals understand themselves.
Yeah.
Rather than put words into their mouth, I think it's just fair to try to take them at their word and see if we can strongman that argument.
Yeah.
So you describe for us in the essay a 218-page curriculum, a guide for educators that is a Jewish sensibilities guide that does not ever once mention the words Zionism or Zionist.
Yeah.
And of course, as I hear that claim, that fact that it doesn't mention those words, it seems deliberately evasive to me. But let me just see if we can put it to try to penetrate their own self-understanding. What is the theory of Jewish identity that is operating there? What do they think that they're strengthening when they create a Jewish sensibilities guide in that way?
It's a great question, John. I think that when you read a document like this Jewish sensibilities document, and some of the other curricular material that comes from Hillel International, the emphasis is hugely on pluralism. And that has actually a noble origin in the foundations of Hillel itself. We'll probably get a chance to get into this, but something I talk about in the essay is the foundations of Hillel were a rabbi, Reform rabbi named Benjamin Frankel, who actually wasn't able to receive the funding for Hillel, this, sort of Jewish campus organization that he had created from his Reform rabbinical assembly. And instead, he turns to the B'nai B'rith, which at the time is almost already 100 years old and is the most important Jewish philanthropic organization in America. And the condition for receiving that funding is that there cannot be a denominational exclusion in this organization that Rabbi Frankel, along with Dr. Abram Sacker, who was his co-founder and later also national director of the organization, that there can be no denominational exclusion, that it's going to serve all Jews to the extent that that is possible for one organization to do. That's its origins. And in that sense, it's a noble idea, maybe not always attainable, but what that's morphed into is something that is actually uprooted itself from the Jewish tradition, which has, important notions of Klal Yisrael and Am Yisrael that do include all the different versions of whatever people are practicing at that time, and has instead grafted itself onto a notion of progressive pluralism. And that notion of progressive pluralism isn't necessarily about creating an opportunity for different expressions of Judaism, but actually values some more than others, and specifically those that cater towards the social justice mores of whatever day and age they happen to be a part of. And I think that is where a lot of Hillel employees, very noble-minded people, are nevertheless being led astray and ultimately weakening the institution that attempts to not be a tent for both Orthodox Jews and non-observant Jews, but instead seems to be more and more a tent for people who don't like Israel, who hate Israel, who have no interest or desire to have Jewish interaction, and at the same time then excludes those who are very pro-Zionist, those who are very observant, because they feel like, why do they want to be a part of an organization that has decided to cater to what are frankly not Jewish values anymore? And I think that is
what
what...
It's confusing, because if you're the sort of person that is an anti-Zionist, why would you be interested in Hillel? Why would you go to Hillel in the first place?
And unfortunately, the reality is that it's often utilitarian. It's often strategic, John, where we already saw in the mid-2010s a thing called the Open Hillel movement, which was an attempt to break down one of the most important and enduring values that Hillel does uphold, which is its guidelines for welcome speakers. So these guidelines say that if you have persistent disruptive behavior, if you don't agree that Israel has a right to exist, if you call for the destruction of the state of Israel, you are not welcome to come to Hillel and to spew your views. And this open Hillel movement attempted to basically get Hillel to stop enforcing this standard, a standard of partnership, is the term. And I think that is what we're seeing now today too. There are many who are on these fringe elements, the kind of JVP crowd, who have been trying to infiltrate Hillel and trying to open Hillel up again in order to further its ideological capture, and in fact maybe start to inject real anti-Zionism into Hillel, which, thank God, has not been the case up till this point.
To me, listening to you, there are probably listeners to this conversation, Josh, who are hearing what you're saying about Hillel, and their mind goes to all kinds of other Jewish pluralistic organizations. Yeah. It invites this broader question. Can any doctrinally pluralistic institution endure beyond the vision of its founding generation? Hillel was not Orthodox or Reform. It was for all Jews. Yeah. By contrast, the contrast that you draw in the essay is with Chabad, of course. Yeah. Chabad has very clear doctrinal commitments, open to everybody, but it's very clear about what it believes, and it makes, if you want to use this kind of vocabulary, very bold, uncompromising truth claims that orient its vision and its work. So I guess the question is, does that suggest that pluralistic institutions inevitably are going to revert to the nostrums of the general secular culture? Is there something inherently unstable about big tent Jewish institutions?
Right. And John, I'm not a professional philosopher or political scientist or anything like that, so I don't know that I have the answer to that question, but you do tend to see a trend towards gradual diminishment of the ideological boundaries of pluralistic organizations. And I think the contrast to Chabad is very apropos. Obviously, it's one that I draw in my essay. And I think maybe I could answer your question best by just talking a little bit more about why I included Chabad in my essay. I thought it was a really telling contrast because, just like you say, John, here's an organization, here's, people, really is what it comes down to, who are making truth claims. I think the way I put it was that Chabad families believe in God, Rebbe, traditional family values. Like, that's really what they're down to. And of course, like mitzvot, as the way that, you fulfill all of this, you bring it all together. And yet, that sense of certainty about what they believe in allows them to have anyone who wants to walk through the door of that house for Shabbat dinner or for a learning or for any other opportunity, because they know that they're not going to change their belief structure just to appease someone who's come in, not even a group of people who've come in. There's no Chabad that has ever gone to a campus and said, you know what, we have to give up all of this stuff that we believe in, or we have to hide it because otherwise there's no way we're going to be able to connect with these students. Instead, Chabads have said, we are going to draw people to us by the power of our convictions. And I think that is maybe what I would say about pluralistic organizations in general. To the extent that you can keep your conviction, you're probably going to be able to keep your boundaries and your sense of identity as an organization. But perhaps after that founding generation, or perhaps the generation after that, if you don't come to some sort of conviction other than openness and welcomeness, then you may be in for a descent into amorphous.
There can be. You can certainly imagine external stimulus that galvanizes a kind of refounding or renewal. For example, that Chabad may have drifted, and then the 1967 war, the Six-Day War in Israel, brought people back with renewed focus. Yeah. And here's the sad part to me. October 7th could very well have been precisely that occasion for Hillel's renewal. Yeah. And it so far at this moment, if one reads your account, it looks like that so far it has failed that test.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This was a moment of crisis, a moment of possible recentering and reconsolidation. I'm going to start from the top. John, I think you're right. I think this could have been, October 7th could have been a moment for reconsolidation, for getting a sense of what the organization must value and must put forward above all else. And what I'd say is that it seems you're right. This is what I suggest, at least, that they've missed that opportunity. But the reality is that the generations who are going to make up Hillel from this point forward, they did not miss that opportunity. Those who want to go into the Jewish world, they are going to remember October 7th as their wake-up call, or maybe their October 8th is their wake-up call. And that is going to change all the organizations in Jewish life. And Hillel, if it, I think, wants to be the organization that it has been for the past 100 years, is going to have to recognize that that is what is coming down the pipeline, whether they want it or not.
Mm-hmm. So you think that there's a chance that recalibration will happen, but it's generational, and that as the October 8th generation rises to positions of responsibility, that recalibration will happen. Let's keep going, because you bring a number of other examples, and I want to make sure that listeners have a full grasp of the evidence that you bring. These illustrative sort of case studies in Chabad's mission creep or ideological capture, or however you want to call it. You describe Israel Fellows, okay? And in a moment, I want you to explain who those people are and where they come from. But Israel Fellows attending a national award ceremony, whispering to one another, Sonei Yisrael, when looking upon the people who are being awarded by Hillel. Sonei Yisrael means Israel haters. And there's the sense that you can learn a lot about an organization by the people to whom it wants to give honor.
Yeah.
But that, combined with the snickering that you overhear on the part of Hillel professionals about Dara Horn and her recent book, Everyone Loves Dead Jews, and Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism groups. So here's the question: how widespread is that kind of attitude? Is it most Hillel professionals? Is it just a vocal minority? Just give us the context for these allegations and what you learned from them.
Yeah. So what I'd say, John, is first of all, I've always got to have a caveat here, which is that I worked for Hillel for 3 years, and I worked for 2 different Hillels during that time. And so I can only speak from what I saw in that time and in those places. And actually, let me take that back from the top. So I just want to say that I only worked for Hillel for 3 years, so I only have my limited perspective. What I'd say is that it's not exactly how many people, which is of concern, but I think it's the particular people in their positions of power in the organization that I think is most of concern. Something I describe in the essay is the way that the structure of Hillel has been reshaped in the past 25, 30 years has allowed it to have much more control from the top down on individual campus Hillels, so that it really matters what's happening at Hillel International as much as it does the makeup of any individual campus center. With that being said, I'd say that there are definitely people who have been given the highest awards by Hillel, and people who are quite close to the top of Hillel who are unfortunately uncertain about what matters to the organization and its sense of identity and self-preservation in especially this time of crisis. And I feel like, John, you had another question that I didn't capture. Could you remind me?
Yeah. The question is to comment on who are the Israel Fellows, Sonei Israel. Tell us about these different, with snickering at Dara Horn. Tell us about these little pieces of evidence that you adduce to be able to substantiate the claim that it's not just,
Yeah.
that there is a leadership consensus that is partially responsible for this institutional confusion.
Yeah. Okay. So when I heard the comment Sonei Yisrael, that was one of my wake-up calls, where I realized that there might be something about the organization that I, as an American Jew, couldn't quite see the way that my Israeli colleagues did. Now, John, the Israel Fellows are young Israelis, post-army, who have been brought and selected by a combination of the Jewish Agency and individual Hillels. And they are often selected to be very interactive with college students, but also it seems that many campuses also screen for political views. So they tend to be very left-leaning, they tend to be very liberal, and yet even these very somewhat left-leaning, liberal Israelis, they are the ones who are saying Sonei Israel. They are the ones who are probably most critical of the government of Israel. They're probably most critical of the actions of the state of Israel. And yet they are the ones who are nevertheless still sensing that the people who are being given the highest awards by Hillel, the people also presenting those awards, are Sonei Israel, Israel haters. So that to me was a very telling moment. And I think in general, yes, you look at who is being given these awards by Hillel, you look at who are the highest figures at different Hillels and in Hillel International, and you start to sense that, yes, there is a critical mass of members of the organization who are, at the very least, uncertain about where they stand, and perhaps at worst are bordering on anti-Zionism. And I think, too, the notion that you could mock Dara Horn and her really noble efforts in writing and lectures and in speeches, I think that is already a sign of also a political anger and animosity. And I think that came out even more when I heard, a select group of the highest level educators in Hillel who'd all been selected from across the nation for this seminar that we were a part of, and they're laughing at Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism. And I think I read that as political animus. The notion that these, working women, parents of children, are somehow laughable because they want stronger action against those who make life in college unbearable for their children. So I think that is some of the dynamics that I saw and some of the basis for what I wrote.
Let's go on to one of the big ideas that the essay contains. You invoke Ruth Weiss's argument about the politics of accommodation.
Yeah.
Diaspora Jews excelling by conforming to the manners and mores of the host society, sometimes, in fact, often at the expense of their Jewishness. Yeah. But America held out a different promise. It was supposed to be a place where you could be wholly Jewish and wholly American. So, out of the basis of this example at Hillel, what happened? What went wrong in your account?
Yeah. So, Ruth Weiss has a devastating analogy that she draws in her book, Jews in Power, where she says that unlike Israelis, who have since literally the moment their nation was declared, been fighting to preserve materially their society, their state, their people, Jews of Europe were so committed to building an ethical, a moral, and a philosophical project of their Judaism that they didn't take the time to create the defenses for the children who would then live out and who would perpetuate those philosophical and moral legacies. American Jews are the inheritors, in many senses, of those same European Jews who were decimated in the Holocaust. We have not had to defend ourselves materially from the moment that we arrived on American shores. In fact, we have been blessed and privileged to have great safety and great support from American government and the American people. And so we are liable, we are prone to underrating the necessity of physical and real material defense of actual human Jewish life. And that is something that we need to have antidotes for. We need to stimulate ourselves to overcome the sense of safety that we are blessed to feel comes naturally to us. And I think that is where Hillel has been most wanting in these past 2 years.
You know, if you just follow the extension or the implication of that argument, Josh, I think you would have to say that Jewish American weakness is a consequence of the American embrace. In other words, it's not that we got here and the hostility weakened Jewish attachment. It's that the embrace weakened Jewish attachment.
Yeah, I think so. I think absolutely. And
so
sorry.
Maybe it'd be valuable. Maybe it'd be valuable to share, a little bit about yourself. What you share in the essay. You describe yourself as a rank stereotype. Yeah. A liberal Jew mugged by reality. That's a very pregnant and favorite Tikvah phrase, coming from Irving Kristol. You were a lifelong leftist, a member of the International Socialist Organization, like a fanboy of Howard Zinn over here. And then something happened. Maybe you could just tell us what was the thing that made you reconsider the commitments that had formed you.
Yeah.
And what changed?
Yeah. So before October 7th, I remember October of 2018, when I was standing in a bookstore, enjoying the browsing selection, and a text comes in that is my first warning, my first notification of the Tree of Life massacre that has just happened in Pittsburgh. And that is the first moment where I realized that anti-Semitism is not a microaggression, as I am at that point fond of maybe saying, when I feel like, standing up for Jews, but is in fact a deadly reality. And from that point forward, I began to see things both in my academic environment and in the larger world that didn't add up, where I realized that for all of the claims of standing up for every minority who was attacked, somehow Jews didn't count. Somehow Jews were accepted from that tally of the left's values. And it made me realize that maybe, in fact, those values are not rooted in a real sense of genuine equality, a real sense of the dignity of human souls, but actually might be politically motivated, and might be subject to the same ideological dangers that the left I had been listening to for so long had been rallying against. But the reality is that it was a slow process from there of questioning my commitments until, frankly, October 7th just blew them out of the water. It was in the days and the weeks and the months afterwards when I saw not just the colleagues that I had had in academia who were falling over themselves to praise the Hamas barbarities, but also a general media environment, a scholarly community that was, it seemed, incapable of recognizing the actual evils that had manifested before our very eyes, that had been filmed on GoPro cameras, but that somehow hadn't penetrated the occlusions and the moral blindness of the left. And to me, it was no longer a question of what parts of the progressive values I had come from that were salvageable, but the recognition that, in fact, those values had been tainted at their origin and their source.
Okay, one of the organizing principles of your essay is this politics of accommodation and ideological critique. But that kind of argument sits alongside a different kind of way of thinking about what has happened and what caused these problems at Hillel. And that's what I'd call like your professionalization critique. That's something about the mechanism and structure of how Hillel as an organization staffs its centers.
Yeah.
So let's step into that subject now. From 1988 to 2003, Richard Joel was the president of Hillel. He would go on later, of course. Many listeners of this program will recognize the name as the longtime president of Yeshiva University. But before that, when he was running Hillel, he transformed that organization, severing it from B'nai B'rith, centralizing authority, making rabbis optional. These reforms, you can tell us if you think that they made sense in their own terms, but the effect or the purpose of them was for Hillel's to become more professional, better funded, to improve the quality. It should be a little less Hamish, a little more professional, like that. So here's the question, I think. How does that kind of effort at rational institutional improvement then contribute to Hillel's being a vehicle of ideological capture?
Yeah. So what I would say to start is, of course, that I'm an immense admirer of Joel. I think that he is an institutional genius in the sense that he was able to transform what was at that point a 70-plus-year-old organization into a lean, mean fighting machine for the 21st century. And I would say, too, that some of what Joel initiated, he didn't actually see through to the very end. That actually is the responsibility of Eric Fingerhut, who was himself a visionary who I don't touch on in the essay, but whose contributions still even today are widely recognized and also greatly respected. Now, both of these visionary men ended up creating a situation that they did not anticipate, which was that by professionalizing the organization, by removing the necessity of having rabbis as leaders of the organization, as the figureheads of Hillel, they created an opportunity for managerial elites to come in and start to re-envision the organization in the vision of something more corporate, less spiritual, certainly less religious. And that has now had the effect of bringing in people who I don't think are as rooted as the earlier generations of Hillel leaders in the Jewish spirit and in the Jewish knowledge that is required in order to lead what is not just another nonprofit, but is responsible for forming and shaping the souls of young Jewish college students. And the ability of a very centralized organization as well to have control through funding and through curricular programming upon the nature of each individual Hillel, that is also very concerning. And so I'd say that as a institutional innovation, incredible. But the results that we've seen have meant something of the hollowing out of Hillel's spiritual mission on college campuses.
I mean, you quote Richard Joel as acknowledging to you that Hillel was always progressive.
Yeah.
I'm curious, just how did that conversation go? Does he see the problem that you're diagnosing the same way that you do? Does he think that you misunderstand Hillel's mission?
I think that Joel and I do see that differently. When he said that Hillel's have always been progressive, that the people gravitating to them are of campus, I pushed back and I said, I think that there's something different happening now. And so like I said, I think we disagree on that. I think Joel sees the way that Hillel is now as a development in its history. I see it as more of a departure, that there was created a possibility of something quite foreign from certainly Rabbi Frankel's or Dr. Sacker's original vision of what Hillel ought to be, it allowed that to come in, and I think that we're seeing that now. And one of the reasons I wrote my essay was because I'm concerned about where that departure could lead. I think now is a perfect time to address the situation and to address some of the dangers that have arisen and some of the risks of the professionalized version of Hillel that has come into existence. I'm not sure in 15 or 20 years that same intervention will be possible.
You describe early Hillel as being even more decentralized. Local chapters, largely autonomous. There was centralized funding from B'nai B'rith, but without a lot of programmatic oversight.
Yeah.
Then this new accreditation model created a much heavier top-down organization, which, as we were just saying, made it vulnerable to ideological takeover.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything that leads you to think that institutions could avoid that trap, meaning that they could, on the one hand, become more professional, but not be capturable in the same way?
So, I think to bring it up again, Chabad is a pretty stellar example. Chabads didn't make the mistake of centralizing their, so I should say, let me clarify, the arm of the larger Chabad movement, Chabad on Campus, which has been around since 1969, they have not had the same kind of extreme professionalization. Each individual Chabad house on a campus is responsible for its own funding. And in that sense, they are responsible for their own self-sustenance and their particular way of delivering their message and their services. Now, one of the reasons that works is that Chabad does have a quite consistent vision of what it wants to offer. There's no one who is going to start a Chabad on campus who isn't mission aligned with what Chabad is about. And so I'd say that that's an example of, the key parallel institution for Hillel to compare itself to. But I would say that even in Hillel's current structure, it does have an advantage, which is that it is now so centralized that it could quite easily enforce more robustly some of its own stated claims about its values and its principles.
If it had the will to do so.
Exactly. Unfortunately, I mean, some of the stories that I heard were of blatant violations of even the standards for partnership that I mentioned earlier, that Hillel seem to be bringing people to campus who I don't think, from an outside perspective at least, anyone would think remotely palatable or appropriate for these organizations. And so the ability of Hillel International to do something like what Joel did, which was quite, I don't want to say brutal, but it was quite stern. He let people go if they were not able to achieve the accreditation that he thought was necessary to bear the Hillel name. And similarly, we have an opportunity now to, Hillel, I should say, has an opportunity now to enforce that same line in terms of its stated vision and values.
Right, and when thinking about the viability of reform, you do call in the essay for a crisis playbook that would enforce Israel guidelines, replace directors who can't execute or don't, emphasize survival and American ideas over accommodation.
Yeah.
But still, I think there's another level to think about there. If the problem is at the top, at Hillel International, and how actually would reform happen?
Yeah.
And to me, I guess I could see two possible sources of renewed pressure and vitality. One would be from the donor community, and the other would be from students themselves.
Yeah. I think that both those pushes are necessary to see the kinds of reforms that I, as a Hillel former employee and someone who does actually love the organization, and I think it has, you don't throw away 100 years of history for nothing, right? I think that both those populations are necessary to create a reform if a reform is going to happen. And from the students, it's already beginning. We see it in the fact that, for example, Hillel International has these student boards that they put together, and I happen to know that those boards are being screened currently to favor liberal students because there are so many of the top students at Hillel's who are done playing by the values of this progressive pluralistic Judaism that doesn't actually respond to what they recognize as either authentic Judaism or Judaism that is rooted in the desire for survival. So those students, the emerging leaders, they are already leaning towards pushing Hillel to be more vigorous in its defense of Jewish values. I don't know about the donors, so I don't know what their push has been, but I would say you would need both these factors together to create that push.
So, Josh, as we round out our discussion now, I'm curious if you've gotten any feedback from Hillel students, from former colleagues who are on the professional staff at Hillel. What have you heard?
Since I've published the essay, which is now, I can't even remember, like 2 weeks ago or something, I have had a steady stream of communications from students, from parents, from other staff members who I have met in the past or not met ever at all, who are reaching out to tell me that what I wrote resonates for them and that they are experiencing these things. And I think the most heartbreaking and the most powerful of these contacts that I've had are with students of Hillel past and present, who have shared some also truly heartbreaking stories too about when they realized that Hillel was never going to be for them. Presidents of Hillels who left midterm because they were so distraught by the way that the organization that they were lending their names to, in a sense, right, by being Hillel president, was reflecting badly on them. So that is something that I would throw in as well to, corroborate my claim that I'm already seeing this movement from the students, at least.
It sounds, Josh, like you're not advocating to burn it all down and eradicate Hillel from the texture of campus life in America, that you think that there are reform possibilities here. And one has to take note of the metastasizing effect on the brand as a whole that particular examples of really bad Hillel leadership structures have on the whole.
I do not want this essay to be taken as a finger pointed at one individual Hillel or another. Certainly, I don't think that the things that I described were happening at the Hillels that I was a part of. But I say that not to exonerate, my past places of employment or that of any other, because I'm sure that many people who are listening to this conversation will have positive Hillel experiences that they can refer back to. I think it's important, though, that this critique be made precisely for the reason that there are Hillels that are different. Because for every Hillel that is different, if there is an encounter with a Hillel that is all of the things that I've criticized, that is going to destroy potentially a student's or a parent's relationship with the Jewish community institutionally in a lasting way, to sow a sense of doubt and distrust in our Jewish institutions as able to embody and to embrace and to enforce even the values and the principles that we hold dear. And so it's urgent for the Hillels that are doing this amazingly well, that Hillel as a movement overall also address these concerns, lest they be damaged by their relationship to the larger movement.
If Hillel is not for Jews, who will be, is the cover essay at Commentary in December 2025. Josh Tolle, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jonathan, for having me.